Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing the Seascape in colored pencil. It's a nice detailed drawing with a lot of these rocks and waves, and I'm going to show you how I did it. I have my paper taped down and I'm going to start working on the sketch. But before I tell you a few words about my materials and the composition, I just want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check out my other videos. I have plenty of landscapes as well as other types of drawings. Don't forget to give me a like and comment. And if you want to see full-length narrated videos and additional content, don't forget to check out my Patreon. As for the composition, this time it's a little bit more complex. So I'm going to have a slightly asymmetrical scene where most of these rocks will be on the left, and the horizon, the line of the water on the right, is going to be about 2/3 of the height of the paper. And on the left I'm going to have this rocky shore with a lot of these rocks and some foaming water and waves around them. And on top of those rocks I'm going to have some trees. Now, I don't normally use rulers, but here I wanted my horizon, the line of the water, to be both straight and level, so I used the ruler just this once. The water is going to be slightly darker than the sky, and for the sky I'm going to be using this light phthalo blue, which is not an ideal color for the sky, but I like the color, and I like how it interacts with this surface, with this background color of my paper. And now I should probably say a few words about the materials. As usual, I'm mostly using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I'm working on a 1000 grit waterproof sandpaper. A lot of people ask me in the comments, did they hear me right? Did I say sandpaper? Yes, sandpaper. This is regular sandpaper that you can find in hardware stores. So it's a 1000 grit sandpaper. It's a fine grit, and it's an excellent surface for colored pencil and pastels. I prefer colored pencils most of the time. Now let me say a few words about the drawing process here. I'm using some blending stumps for blending my colored pencils, and in addition to them I also like to use hard bristle brushes, flat bristle brushes. What you want to do here, because the background is a little bit darker than the color of the sky that I'm trying to achieve, you want to cover it very thoroughly. So I have to make sure that I color in all of this very patiently. I can't use too much pressure, and I have to keep my pencil fairly sharp. I can use my blending tools a little bit, but I can't rely on them entirely to cover all of this. I still have to put down a lot of pigment. I have to put down a lot of that colored pencil. And here in the middle I'm going to create a slightly lighter area, so I'm going to add a bit of white colored pencil here and try to create a nice gradient. This is a little bit difficult to do on this surface with lighter colors, and especially with slightly harder pencils such as these Faber-Castell Polychromos, but it can be done with some blending tools. I think I will eventually create a nice smooth transition without too much texture. There will always be a little bit of texture left, but the eye usually won't be able to pick up on it or be too distracted by it. Now, one of the reasons why I like to use a combination of both blending stumps and autotillons and brushes is because these two blending tools have slightly different effects. So when I want to make something smoother, I use broad strokes with a brush, and then that tends to even things out a little bit. While blending stumps, they tend to blend things a little bit more thoroughly. In many of my previous videos I'm just making some corrections here and there, going back in with a sharp blue colored pencil, that light phthalo blue that I initially used, and just fixing the appearance of the sky, making it look more even. In some of my previous videos I used paper tortillions that I made myself. Here I decided to use these blending stumps, the kind that you can buy, because I find that they tend to work a little bit better on this surface when blending colored pencils. And yes, colored pencils can be blended on sandpaper. They behave quite differently than they do on regular paper. So if you're not aware of that, you should give it a try. So I'm smoothing everything out with a brush and putting down some finishing touches with a pencil. And now I'm going to move on to the rocks and the trees. I'm going to be using a couple of different colors for these rocks. I have some warmer tones in there, so I decided to use a little bit of this burnt ochre. Now when I finish, not much of this will be visible because the color will be completely changed, but I just wanted it here as a base color so that I would have some slightly warmer tones in there. And of course, blending stumps work wonderfully for blending these slightly darker tones here. But you don't want to overdo it because the rocks are very uneven, very jagged, so you want to retain a lot of that texture. So you want to control not just the amount of pressure. With the blending stumps, you also want to control how much blending you're actually willing to do in different parts of your drawing, depending on how much texture and how much detail you want to produce. Because when you produce these rough textures, they give you this wonderful illusion of detail where the viewer's eye, the viewer's imagination can just see things for itself and imagine things for itself, and that way you don't have to work that hard to draw every single detail. Now here at the top I'm going to draw some trees growing on top of those cliffs, and I'm just drawing the tops of those trees using a dark green colored pencil first, but I'm going to add some black on top of that. The reason why I'm going to use black on top of it is to modify the color a little bit, but also to modify the texture and to create some indications of some shadow areas in between the trees, on the canopy itself and at the bottom of the trees, so that these trees can appear a little bit more three-dimensional, and so that they wouldn't look so flat. And of course I'm giving them a little bit of texture in the process, making those canopies look a bit more interesting, a bit more realistic. But there's no need to overdo it because these are in the distance, it's a part of the background, so I don't really have to worry too much about every single detail here. I'm going to have to put in a lot more work with these rocks, and for the lighter details on these rocks I'm using an ivory colored pencil. Now you have to be careful, this ivory colored pencil is almost white. It's a very light color, but it's off-white, it's slightly yellowish, and it's a little bit darker than white, and I find that it combines well with some of these brownish tones, and I used it for some highlights on my rocks. And when I say highlights, I mean lighter portions of those rocky areas. Basically those parts of the rocks which are facing towards the light source and which are sticking out, because whatever is deeper inside the rock or hidden or facing away from the light source is going to be darker. It's going to be in the shadow, and I'm going to use a darker brown and a black for that. But whatever is facing the light source or jutting out or sticking out or bulging out, those parts of the rocks or those rocks which are sticking out are going to be lighter because they're going to be catching some more light from the light source. The light source is usually coming from above. When you're drawing landscapes, it's coming from the sky, from the sun. But depending on the position of the light source, it can be a little bit more on the left or on the right. Here in this case the shadow side is going to be on the right. So if you look at this cliff all the way on the left, the one that I started drawing, you can see that the right side is a little bit darker. So the light source is coming from the left, and the shadow side, like I said, is on the right. So all of these cliffs, all of these rocks will be darker on their right side, and they're going to be casting a bit of shadow to the right. And all of these highlights, these lighter portions that I'm going to draw with my lighter colored pencils, such as the ivory colored pencil and that ochre, those are going to be on the left. And it's very important to establish that contrast so that you can obviously show the shape of that terrain and make it look more three-dimensional. Now here I did a little bit of work around the rocks by using a white colored pencil. Those are going to be surrounded by waves and foamy water, so I just wanted to draw an edge around them so that I could give myself a better idea about their overall shape, about their outline, their overall shape. And now I'm kind of blocking in some of the larger areas by putting in some slightly lighter and slightly darker brownish tones, and kind of blocking that area in. And I will later do a bit of blending and of course a bit more work on the texture and the details. I just started working on the details in that top left part of the cliff because I wanted to see how my pencils would work, how they would go together. But right now I'm just going to do a little bit more blocking in and a little bit more blending, and after that I'm going to move on with the details. Like I said, these blending stumps, they're a little bit harder than the tortillons I make, and they appear to be doing a better job than regular tortillons on this surface, at least. They appear to be moving this pigment a bit better and blending a bit more thoroughly. Now, of course, depending on how much pencil you put down and how much material you put down and how much blending you do, you can have a little bit more of that background color coming through or a little bit less. So in the case of the sky, you can see I covered that dark sandpaper color fairly thoroughly because the sky looks bright blue, light blue. But with these rocks, I'm actually going to want to keep some of that background color because I can use that darker grayish blue for some of the shadows, and maybe I can allow the that background color to break through every now and then to create a bit of texture. So whatever it is that you're working with, whatever paper or whatever tools that you're using, you need to try to use their properties to your advantage and maybe create something that you would normally have to work a little bit harder for. You have to use the terrain to your advantage, as it were. Now here I am drawing this rock to the left and adding a bit of shadow to it. As you can see, the shadow is being cast to the right because, as I've already explained, the light source is coming more from the left and from above. And I'm doing most of this shadow work with a black colored pencil because I just find that it's so easy to make things darker or draw these shadows on sandpaper with a black colored pencil. And if I want to add some other tones, I can easily do that as well because colored pencils appear to blend better on sandpaper, which is not what they normally do on regular paper. On regular paper you can just sort of layer them and create an illusion of blending. But here, because the rough texture of the surface grinds down on the pencil, you're actually able to blend the colors, blend the pigment more thoroughly, and you can create some wonderful effects. But the thing to keep in mind here is that you want to control how smooth or how rough something looks. So if I overdo it with the layering and the blending, I'm going to muddy things a little bit, and I'm not going to be able to get those wonderful details, that wonderful illusion of details, those rough textures, which is what I want to have here with these rocks. I want to have a whole bunch of these random dots and marks that can perhaps mean something to the eye of the viewer. Each and every one of these lighter dots, for example, that I'm putting down now, can maybe be some kind of smaller jutting rock which is sticking out and catching some light from above. And each and every one of those darker marks can be like a crack or a shadow coming from one of those rocks. So it's just a lot of small suggestions where the eye of the viewer fills in the rest. Because when people look at a detailed drawing like this with a whole bunch of these rocks, it can feel very daunting. It can feel like something that's very difficult to do, but it's actually not that difficult. All you have to do is pay attention to your light source and have a general idea about the shapes and the textures that you want to produce. And after that, things get a lot easier, and you can draw some fairly realistic looking rocks without much effort. Now, in terms of how much time this takes, I think this whole drawing took about 2.5 hours, or less maybe, I'm not really sure. Maybe it was around 2.5 hours, but the rocks themselves probably took more than an hour, maybe an hour and a half, I'm not really sure. But you can do this faster, or you can make it less detailed or more detailed depending on what you're trying to achieve. One of the things that I like to do is I like to create an illusion of detail, and I like to be able to draw in a slightly more spontaneous and quicker way, where I can make something look realistic without too much effort. And of course, colored pencils as a tool, they are not as good as pastel pencils or soft pastels when it comes to covering large areas or blending, and they tend to be better for drawing miniatures, for smaller drawings. When I say miniatures, I mean anything that's under let's say 8 times 10 inches. And this drawing is slightly smaller. This is like maybe 5 times 9 inches or so. So it's a slightly smaller drawing, but I really enjoy doing these smaller landscapes on this smaller format. I know that this is a little bit unusual, but color pencils are really great for these small but detailed drawings. I do a bit of blending here and there on these rocks as well, but generally, as you can see, I avoided using too much of my blending tools because I don't want to ruin the wonderful texture that I'm creating, the texture that will give me that illusion of detail. The illusion of detail that is produced by those random textures is what some people refer to as happy accidents. And one of the ways that I refer to it is allowing the pencil to work for you. Because when you allow the pencil to create some random details and some random textures, you're allowing it to do your hard work for you by producing that illusion of detail. Now, of course, you have to refine it a little bit, but it's up to you what you want to do with it. You can soften that texture a little bit, or you can leave it like that. You can create some new shapes or seize the existing opportunities to create some shapes. It's really up to you. You don't have to stick to your reference photo if you have one. You don't have to stick to it 100%. You can just go with the flow and make some modifications and basically draw whatever you like, and using the reference just for like a general idea. I felt that this top of the cliff here, of these rocks here in the middle, was a little bit too light and too cool, so I added a little bit more of that ochre on top. But of course I'm going to be adding a bit more of this ivory colored pencil. I resharpened it, and now I'm going back in and drawing some of those smaller details and trying to produce a little bit more of that fine texture, making some indications of some smaller rocks. And notice how I'm drawing these lighter areas just above the darker ones, so that it would look like so that I would make everything look more three-dimensional, so that these lighter portions look like they're popping out, like they're sticking out in the terrain, and these darker portions are the sides which are facing away from the light source, or maybe some cracks in the terrain. My footage is not great in terms of quality. It does vary a little bit. Sometimes it's a little bit sharper, sometimes it's a little bit blurry, but it's a slightly smaller drawing, so I had to focus a bit more, to zoom in a little bit more to show you some of the detail. I hope that you can make it out in spite of the limitations of my equipment. One of the things that I like to do with blending tools is I like to soften some of the textures and details in the shadow side, and maybe make those shapes look a bit more abstract, so that the portions of the rock in the light side, which are supposed to catch the attention of the viewer, look a lot more detailed, and they're attracting the attention of the viewer not just because they're lighter, but also because they have a lot more interesting texture and a lot more detail. So one of the ways that you can create that contrast or emphasize that contrast is by simplifying the appearance of the shadow sides of objects, so that they are not only darker but also less detailed in terms of textures and shapes. So here I moved on to these rocks in the foreground. I guess you could consider that a part of the foreground because they're slightly in front of the others. And here we have a few more rocks kind of sloping down towards the left edge, and the shadow side of course is, as always, on the right side. You need to stay consistent with your light source if you want to make sense out of the terrain, because you can keep adding all of these details, you can keep working on these textures, but if you don't define the relationship between the light side and the shadow side, your drawing is just going to fail. It's not going to make sense to the viewer. One of the other things that I also like to do is add a few touches of lighter value in the shadow side, and that can create an illusion like maybe some of these rocks which are in the shadow are sticking out a little bit and maybe catching a bit more light from above. And that really adds to that illusion of a really rough, jagged, uneven terrain. So occasionally adding some of those lighter bits here and there, popping out of the shadow areas, that can really enhance that rough, rocky look that we're trying to achieve. Here I did a little bit more blocking in, and I think the rocks are already starting to look pretty good, but we're going to have some more rocks here in front, and I have to make these even more detailed. I'm adding some slightly warmer and reddish tones here and there just to create a little bit more variation in those rocks. I thought that maybe their appearance was a little bit too cool, so I added some more warmer tones here and there. And here at the bottom we're going to have a whole bunch of these smaller rocks which are kind of separated by foaming water. We're going to have some white splashing water all around these smaller rocks, but I'm going to get to that later. So as I've already mentioned, If you want to see much longer videos and if you want to observe the drawing process in real time, you should check out my Patreon. There I upload full-length narrated videos and I share with my patrons almost all of the raw footage that I have. I don't record 100% of the drawing process. Sometimes I lose a little bit of footage, sometimes I forget to turn on the camera, but in most cases I provide at least 95% of the drawing process, and the explanations and the narration is far more detailed. So if you want to check that out, there's plenty of content there. Here on my main channel, as you can see, I have plenty of landscape drawings, both in charcoal but also in colored pencil, because this is slowly becoming one of my new favorite mediums. I'm starting to enjoy drawing landscapes with colored pencils on sandpaper. I think this combination works really well, especially on a smaller sized paper like this one. Here I'm kind of trying to figure out what to do with these rocks and what shapes I'm trying to produce. But it's a little bit easier with these smaller ones. With these flat, larger parts of the rock, it's a little bit more difficult for me to decide what exactly I want them to look like, and also creating that illusion of detail can sometimes be a little bit difficult when you have a larger, smoother faces of rock. So it can be a little bit difficult to convey that texture to the viewer. So I just decided to add a few cracks here and there. I decided to add a few lighter bits, and I even added a touch of some other colors like green and some others. But one of the things that will always work for me is when I hold the pencil sideways and just drag it gently over the surface of the paper. That will produce some rough and unpredictable texture, and I can just use that texture to convey that roughness of the terrain to the viewer. You can see some nice shadows here at the bottom and some nice shadows being cast to the right. That's what I want. I want this great range of value. I want this contrast. I want these rocks to really pop out. And now I'll just move on with the water. The water is also going to be complex, not quite as complex as the rocks, because I'm going to try to find a way to simplify it. But here are some of the things that I decided to do. I started out with a little bit of turquoise colored pencil, which I felt was a little bit too light. Then I added a bit of darker green to it and blended that with a Tortillion until I got that slightly darker greenish blue color that I wanted. Here in the foreground I drew another rock which is in the shadow, and I'm going to add a bit of lighter details on it as well, but it's mostly going to be dark, and I'm going to add some a small shadow on the water to the right. So most of the work on the water is going to consist of me combining a couple of different blues and greens to create something that kind of looks like the color of the sea, and trying to produce a whole bunch of these waves and trying to create the appearance of splashing foamy water. Now here around the rocks, this part is especially important because what you want to do is you want to draw a bit more of those white lighter portions around the rocks themselves, where the water is hitting against the rocks and splashing the rocks and maybe pouring over some of these smaller rocks. So you want to try to create some of these smaller details, and you don't have to draw every single drop of water or every single stream, but what you want to do is create just a few suggestions here and there. And the same goes with these waves and ripples in the water. You can't really draw every single one, but what you want to do is you want to try to produce that illusion like there's a whole bunch of waves there. And we'll see how good I will be able to convey that to the viewer. I'm not an expert at drawing waves. There are some painters and other artists on YouTube who actually do a great job at drawing realistic looking waves. I'm just going to try to wing it and simplify it a little bit, because that's just my style, and I think also the size of this drawing demands it. But another thing which I want to mention here, which is very important, is that you couldn't do this on regular paper. This is why I like to draw on sandpaper, because it allows you to draw layers upon layers and add layers upon layers, and it allows you to work from dark to light. You can see how much darker the background is, and I already added some darker colors to that water, but I can easily add some lighter colors, and you can see that they look almost completely white, so very little of that background color is breaking through. And this is something that you can only do on sandpaper. You wouldn't be able to do this on regular paper, because you simply wouldn't be able to put down those lighter details on top of the darker ones. It just wouldn't work. You would muddy the colors a little bit. You would maybe blend them a little bit, make them a little bit lighter, a little bit softer, but you wouldn't be able to produce these sharp details, small details, like I did with these waves and ripples in the water. I'm going to draw some more rocks here to complete this scene. I'm going to have a few more of these smaller rocks in the middle and on the right. I drew that outline with a brown color, and I'm going to add a few more colors to that. Now, I skipped over a part of the footage here, unfortunately, because my camera wasn't working, but let me just describe what I did in the meantime. I used this darker Prussian blue to add some more variation to this color of the water, to the color of the sea or the ocean, whatever it is, and I combined that with the light phthalo blue. Now what this combination of these two colors, the lighter blue and the darker blue, does, it already allows me to create some suggestions of movement of water, of some waves and ripples in the water. But of course, in order to make this look even more realistic, I'm going to be adding a whole bunch of these foamy waves here and there. So in the distance, I'm going to be adding a few smaller ones, just a few small white marks, because obviously the waves which are further back, further in the distance, they are going to be a lot smaller, a lot less visible, while the ones in front are going to be a lot larger. So if you want to create that feeling of depth in your landscape, you have to pay attention to these things, that things will be getting larger as they get closer to your point of view, but they will be getting smaller and smaller as you look further in the distance. A few more rocks here and a little bit more of that foamy water around them, so I keep adding some of these smaller details here and there just to break up the monotony of that blue surface of the water, because I want a lot of movement in the water, I want a lot of these waves, but the key is producing this splashing foamy water, especially around the rocks. That is what will really add that realistic look of the splashing water, and it will also, that contrast will also allow your shapes, those shapes of the rocks, to pop out and to look really three-dimensional and really realistic. realistic. So here in the distance, like I said, I'm drawing smaller ripples, smaller suggestions of waves, and as I'm moving closer to the foreground, these will be getting larger and larger. Now, one of the things that you need to remember when drawing the splashing water with a white colored pencil is to allow the pencil to work for you. You shouldn't try to draw every single ripple or every single dot, because that will be very time consuming, and it will actually be very frustrating, because you will find that it's almost impossible for you to produce something that looks exactly like your reference. That's very, very difficult. It would probably take many hours, and that's not really what I'm trying to do here. What you want to do is create some suggestions of splashing water and create some textures that kind of look like splashing water and ripples in the water, which will end up looking realistic enough to trick the eye of the viewer that they're looking at a very detailed, realistic looking drawing of a seascape. Some more detail on these rocks here, and some more lighter details on them as well, so that I can make them a little bit more three-dimensional. Of course, always staying consistent with the light source. My light is coming from the left, so the shadow side is on the right. And I'm occasionally adding a bit of these darker details with this darker blue here and there. This variation in the blue color is also very important, because that by itself will create some suggestions of waves in the water without me adding these white splashing bits. So you have to try to imitate the movement of the water. All of these waves, they kind of have their raised parts and their lower parts. These lower parts are called troughs, and the raised part is called the crest. So here and there you want to try to imitate that shape of the waves, but you don't have to draw every single one. Just a few suggestions will be enough. And here in the middle we have just a large area of splashing water, where a lot of these waves are kind of merging and splashing against one another, and here I really don't have to try to define every single wave. But what I want to do here is I want to allow the pencil to work for me again. You can see how much of that wonderful texture the white colored pencil produced, and I did that just by dragging it over the paper, and it produces that splashing foamy effect without me actually having to do a lot of work. And that's what I like. I like being lazy and creating realistic looking drawings with a minimum amount of effort. Of course, you can refine that texture here and there by adding some of those lighter streaks or streams of water, those splashy bits around the crest of the waves, and you can join them together in a way that makes sense to you. You can even add a few of those bits of splashing water here and there, but like I said, it's just some suggestions. You don't have to try to draw every single wave, and to do that would be very time consuming, and you would also have to understand the shape of the waves a little bit better than I do, because like I said, I'm not that great at drawing very detailed looking water. So I'm kind of putting down some of the finishing touches here. I'm mostly happy with the appearance of the water. I deliberately created that greenish area on the left and in the middle. I wanted the water to change its color slightly. I wanted it to look a little bit lighter here at the bottom and a bit darker near the horizon, with a bit more of those dark blue segments. And here in the foreground I'm adding some more of those lighter details with a light phthalo blue, just to create a bit more variation in that blue color. And my paper was taped down to a piece of cardboard with a few pieces of tape. And as you can see, I removed one of them and finished the corner. I'm going to do the same thing with the others, but I'm just working on some of the details here, softening the textures in those areas where I don't like them, adding some more textures and details in some other areas, and so on. I'm just going over some of these lighter portions of the waves because I want some of them to be almost completely white. I want them to be a bit lighter than the others. Some of this is getting a little bit difficult now because the paper is saturated with layers of colored pencil, and it can be a bit difficult for me to get a really strong white, but I think it looks good enough. I'm just going to finish this other corner here. There it is. And just a few more finishing touches, maybe a few more of these smaller rocks here and there which are jutting out of the water. And I think the drawing is almost done. That should probably do it. I'm just going to put a small signature, very tiny signature, in the lower right corner. And that's it. The drawing is finished. I hope you like this seascape in colored pencil, and I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Don't forget to check out my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye.